Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to give it a few minutes to let everybody make it in and get set up. Good evening, everybody. We got a few joining us tonight. All right, there goes another one. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll get started in a few moments. We're just giving a chance for everybody to get in and get logged in and ready to listen and learn. Or learn and listen, your choice. All right. Well, I don't think anybody else has joined us for a few moments, so maybe this is it. All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Trey. I'm one of the genealogy librarians here with the Genealogy Center at Haggard Library. And today we're talking about the obituaries, society columns, and the news, or just simply, we're talking about newspapers, how to locate and use newspapers to find your family doing some of your genealogy research. So the class objectives are, I'm going to provide a basic introduction to what's available in the newspapers. And then we'll go through some different skills of things, some basic tips on how to research newspaper resources and identify where to find newspapers. And I'll take you through where you can discover various online resources to find newspapers. Now, I will say here, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We don't have the cameras on and don't have the mics on, so can't hear you. Hopefully you can hear me. Otherwise, this will be a really long, boring slide deck without listening to what I have to say. Hopefully you'll learn more stuff listening to me than just the slide deck. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And my colleague, Nathan, is monitoring the chat for me. And if I'm going too fast on something, or you need a question pertaining to what I'm talking about, please drop it in the chat and I'll answer. If it's something else more in depth, and maybe wait to the end of the session, and I'll try to answer some of those questions that you might have. So we've got a lot of stuff on tap here, a lot of fun stuff. So we'll get started. So one of the things here that I wanted to mention, or wanted to ask rather, is how many of you have been personally mentioned in a newspaper before? You can just answer yes or no, or I don't know, or briefly in the chat. And unfortunately, I can't see the chat, Nathan, so you'll have to let me know if anybody's responded. And if you may have put no or don't know, you might be surprised. At some point in growing up, maybe elementary school, you may have got a mention of some classroom article about what the class was doing. A lot of smaller communities ran basically reports of the different classes sometimes. Small community newspapers were fond of doing that.
Yeah, no messages in chat just yet, but they might trickle in over the next couple of minutes.
That's fair. That's fair. So what might be available? So certainly, a lot of times people think of the newspapers to look for, birth announcements or marriage announcements, and the social columns, the society information. Maybe there's divorce notices or obituaries, the death notices. There can always be court records, or not court records, but articles about court cases, or it may be the newspaper is the official record for a county or a parish, and they've run legal notices for the community. You also find information, general social events. Maybe someone had a 60th, 50th, 60th, what have you, wedding anniversary. You might have had an article written up about that, celebration of 100th birthdays or 90th birthdays, what have you. Important things that a family may want to share with the wider community of family and friends. You might have social columns where events of the local community were talked about. If you had a family member that might have done something in social or political circles, those might be mentioned. Of course, there's advertisements for newspapers or in newspapers for businesses in the community. And like I'd already mentioned, you got the school events. There may be school plays, or a big one for a lot of communities, obviously, what? Sports. Texas is a big football state, so, and as well as many other sports. Those are all vitally important for a lot of communities, large and small. Not so much here in Texas, in our portion of Texas, but certainly on the Gulf Coast or navigable river, you might have ship arrivals and departures mentioned in the newspapers. So think Galveston, Houston, many of those areas. And you may just have simple news of the day and news of historical importance that were happening at the time. And I'd like to point out that, throughout a whole lifespan of community, newspapers back in the day, and to a certain extent today, as those that still exist, had a lot of important information that they carried for communities. But newspapers may disappear at times. They can go completely out of business. They may be absorbed into larger business conglomerates. A lot of times, communities had multiple newspapers at one time earlier in their history, and over the decades, over the generations, sometimes those newspapers went out of business. Maybe they merged and became one, or just ceased publication altogether because the publisher moved off to another community and started a new newspaper somewhere. Those happen. In more recent times, and we can think of things like during times of war or during disease pandemics, such as during COVID-19, as an example. The Plano Star-Courier didn't publish for a quite number of weeks. And then when it did publish, it was only published on Sundays. And this was, due to the office and the building closures due to the COVID-19. So depending on what might be happening in the larger world, that one newspaper that you think, I know this occurred at this time, you might need to consider, did a wartime something interfere with being published? Of course, I'm more talking about maybe during the American Civil War, or if it's a foreign newspaper from Europe, may have been interrupted during wartime, or in the case of the more recent, COVID-19 pandemic, those things can interrupt the publication schedules. And you never know what you're going to find. it's typically harder to find small town newspapers, even if they even existed. A lot of times in history, a newspaper was established in a small town when a small community was coming together with the settlers, and someone may or may not have recorded a fact that a newspaper existed. You may find some obscure note somewhere mentioning a newspaper by name, and that may be the only clue that you had that a newspaper existed. And no copies may exist anywhere. Because unfortunately, it's just not a one-stop shop to be able to find newspapers. And as I said, the smaller town newspapers are a lot of times harder to find, especially online. But sometimes in a small community, there may be an event happen that gets picked up by the news wires, one of the news services like the Associated Press news service. As an example, and I don't even remember what I was researching, what I was looking at, and I stumbled across, completely serendipitous, a news article about an eyewitness to a bomber aircraft crash, a multi-engine military aircraft that crashed. This is post-World War II. Trying to remember the date. I think it was about 1949, 1950, somewhere along in there. And I found this Associated Press article about this event that happened in the far north of North Louisiana, near the border of Louisiana and Arkansas. And I was like, oh, I know family that was from there. That's interesting. And the article, because it's in one of those news services, small podunk area, I'm not even sure if that small community had a newspaper. One of the adjoining slightly larger towns probably did have a newspaper, but I never found or never seen that. But here's an Associated Press news article that got picked up on the wire services and published at the other end of the state in the Baton Rouge newspaper, telling about this. And the eyewitness to this was none other than my grandfather, which I vaguely remember the family stories because this was before my time, but I do remember the family stories of them talking about this incident, but it jogged some memories. But so it happened in a small community, but if you're lucky, it might be something of a large event. Unfortunately, usually those are disasters, some disastrous calamity, unfortunately, or some major cattle wrestling. I mean, everybody talks about, oh, my relatives were cattle wrestlers. Yeah, not everybody can be a cattle wrestler. They may not have been. They may have not done anything of such importance, but you never know what might get picked up. And while you're focused on searching in a small area in one part of the state, you could actually possibly find it somewhere else and far, far removed from where the original event happened, if that makes any sense. I kind of digress there, but it was an interesting serendipitous story there. So, how to research? You just need to sit down and kind of like when you're looking up and trying to work through filling in the blanks on your ancestral chart, you know what you've got blanks for, what information you need to find. It's kind of the same thing. You look at that. Who are you looking for? Maybe you know where they had lived. You have these different components from your ancestral chart or your family record. So kind of zero in on who you're looking for, where, what time period you might be looking for. And then you can go try to look and see what newspapers might have been in existence in that time that might provide some articles or evidence, photographs, photo captions, something that might have appeared that might yield some little tidbits of information about your family. So those few basic questions, that you ask yourself are all of these. And just decide, who do you want to find? And consider where do you find the newspapers? And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So those are all things to think about. And then when you are searching the newspapers, when you're starting to do your research and actually start looking through the resources, don't forget to make your citation. Don't forget to make your reference of where you found the information. What was the date? What was the newspaper title? Obviously, what was its volume? What was its issue number? You want to be able to duplicate and find that research later. If you find something that you not exactly what you're looking for, but hey, that looks interesting. That's how you find those again. Be helpful. Nothing's worse than going, oh yeah, I remember I saw something, but you stayed focused on your research task at hand, and then you forgot that other little tidbit that looked interesting. Oh, and don't forget the page numbers too. Make a note of the page numbers where you found it as well. In your post-research evaluation, when you're reflecting on what you found, always ask yourself two very important questions. How did this help? And where do I go from here? So newspapers can be a primary and secondary source of information, but you still have to kind of critically evaluate each article to determine how useful is it to your research. And generally, newspapers are a great source of primary historical information about a community and how it was written about at the time events were occurring or shortly afterwards. Those are interesting and helpful. If it's a retrospective article 80 years hence, that's not a primary source. It may still have some interesting information that points to some earlier information that was published. And a lot of times, well, I won't say a lot of times, sometimes you might run into a case where a modern newspaper will run an entire section or the entire publication, which was a limited number of pages back in the day. So it might have been only 4 or 6 pages, maybe 8 pages for a large, small community newspaper. And they'll, have their great anniversary celebration, much like Plano just celebrated 150 years, and they'll reprint maybe the front page from 1880 or 1900 or 1910. For whatever reason, sometimes those original pages don't exist anymore, but they exist in those later anniversary editions that were, I've seen a number from communities that were published, later in the 1970s or 1980s. And they refer back to something, the previous turn of the century, marking something. And those are still interesting. Not necessarily your primary resource, but that may be your only source for that 1910 page, if that makes any sense. So finding your newspapers. So I'll note here too that really a necessary first step in finding newspapers is to identify what publications existed for a given time period, as I mentioned earlier. and the names for those newspapers. And sometimes that's a harder task than it seems it should be a lot of times. And don't be surprised that over the decades, communities, both large and small, may have had several newspapers. And also, as I had mentioned, they get bought out by other publications and they get merged. So their records or their libraries of publication libraries get absorbed and merged into a new entity with a completely new name. And sometimes a publication may have been a weekly that's now a daily, that's now going back to a weekly. All those things, I guess you could say the genealogy of or the etymology of the newspaper are important to know. Was it published weekly? Did it publish on Thursdays? Did it come out on Fridays? Because if you're looking for it on a Monday or Tuesday for a weekly paper that only came out on Friday, you're not going to find that, obviously. So you kind of have to have an idea of when something happened and be a little flexible, because it may not have printed immediately after an event. It may have been the next week or a couple of weeks hence before something would get published. Also, there were morning and afternoon or evening newspapers, and historically the afternoon and evening newspapers were the least likely to survive in business. A lot of times it was the morning papers, the ones that published, the daily papers that publish in the morning. You've got your daily paper, morning paper with your cup of coffee. Well, you could argue that the evening paper as well, but that's old news already. It's already happened. We already know about it during the day. I don't know if that's true, but it is interesting that many of the afternoon and evening papers were usually the first ones to close in a community. So you're looking for around the town or around where a person lived to look for those newspapers. You're looking for the neighboring towns and cities, what county or what region. Sometimes there was newspapers that covered more than one county or parish, more of a regional newspaper. They may contain information, even if there was a local newspaper for that small town within a county, there may have been also another newspaper that covered a larger area. Also look at towns, communities where relatives lived. That may seem similar to the first one, a town where the person lived, but that's where the person lived. But then your extended relatives or that person's that you're researching, extended relatives, where did they live? So if someone passed away, let's say, and you're looking for an obit, an obituary may have run in the town where the person lived, but it may also have run in another town, even if another state, where that individual had a large concentration of relatives, other friends and family. So that may be helpful. If the one small town newspaper is lost to time, but an obituary ran somewhere else that's larger newspaper, you might stand a better chance. The odds are better that you might be able to find something. Many times there were newspapers, publications, magazines even in ethnic communities. So it may have be an immigrant community, maybe an Irish, or it might have been a Jewish community. It might have been a African-American community or Cuban community. They may have their own community newspaper. And a lot of times that might be in the native language, the foreign language. And those might yield some information. Excuse me. Any kind of religious affiliations. Sometimes there were newspapers published associated with particular church groups sometimes were published. And of course, university and colleges may have collections of newspapers and or university newspapers themselves. Now, granted, those would cover university-specific events, but sometimes they would cover news that was pertinent to both the university and the larger community in hand. Probably not as useful for genealogy research, but as far as special collections that house newspaper collections for a community, historic newspaper collections, they may be a good viable source. And just as an example of some of our local, we have the Plano Star Courier. There was the Plano Insider, there's the Community Impact, and then the neighboring communities. What do we have? We have McKinney Courier Gazette, we have the Frisco Enterprise, Allen American. Then when we're talking the county and region, Dallas Morning News. That's a really good type of example for a larger city metropolitan newspaper that also serves the larger metropolitan area. Because it does cover, it really should be considered a regional newspaper because it does cover a lot of North Texas. And an example of the ethnic communities, there was the North Dallas Gazette. And then the Dallas Chinese News is two examples. And on and on, including like church newsletters, almost kind of like small newspapers. So different various church newsletters sometimes would be published in a format very akin to a newspaper, not just on a 8.5 by 11 Xeroxed or dittoed sheets. Any questions so far?
No questions in chat so far, but I did link the Library of Congress Chronicling America collection. There was a comment about someone enjoys the different language and writing styles from 19th century newspapers compared to the present. So I linked that if people are interested in checking that out.
Yes. Very interesting in the styles of journalism presentation and the articles of through time. Very much so. It is fascinating. Okay. So identifying and finding newspapers. Unfortunately, not every issue is online. That's just the sad truth of it. And not every newspaper exists, period. When you look at it, the history of newspapers and the medium itself, it was very ephemeral. It was meant to be inexpensive, cheap, and you threw it away when you were done. Although a lot of times it's good cellulose, right? So it got repurposed. And in our region, we were a big farming agrarian area. And I personally know of some formerly unknown issues of newspapers that were found in old houses that were getting refurbished, either shoved under the cracks of floorboards to, maybe stop a floorboard squeak or provide more insulation and less draft coming through under the house and cracks. And for some reason, some miracle, then that newspaper survived relatively intact. Sometimes they might have been put up as insulation between walls and houses for the same purpose, insulation. And sometimes those are found in fair enough condition to get those scanned. But those point out the multi-use of newspapers. It happens. But a lot of times the local libraries is a good source to check with to see what newspapers are available. We have a lot of the back issues and a lot of years for our local newspapers in our area on microfilm. And we do have a microfilm reader for those. Unfortunately, there's no index and it's not digitized. It's not searchable. One day, maybe in the future, we can get that done. But right now we have it, but it's old school, laborious, go through skimming the pages with your own eyes, unfortunately. And I've already mentioned you can check the nearby areas to where your ancestors lived to see if there's additional newspapers. And I will throw in this little tip that sometimes smaller community newspapers did exchanges. When we're talking back in the early 1900s, even late 1800s, I'm sure they probably did this as well. But from my experience, and I used to own a small community newspaper, and we had exchanges with neighboring, not really competitors. We played within our own county, but we exchanged newspapers around the state with other members of the press association, just to keep track of what was going on around the state and other communities. So earlier, late 1800s, early 1900s, that was the source of additional news items and gossip. And back in those times, copyright was not a big problem with a lot of publishers, and they would literally clip out articles from another paper and run it in their paper as essentially filler, or it may have something pertinent to them about somebody from one community visiting their community in the social news kind of thing. That would happen. So an article might run in another newspaper, not from the town that you were thinking of. And be flexible. I mentioned that just because something happened on Monday and the paper came out Friday, there's no guarantee that it's going to make the paper on Friday. Depends. If it's a huge impactful story impacting the whole community, shaking the community, again, unfortunately, usually some sort of calamity, it might get run on that week. But be a little flexible. Look beyond that immediate next publication date and check. It might get delayed. They might have pushed it forward until they had more information that the story could develop more. It's pertinent to you because you're looking for your family member or something mentioned, but it may not have made the cut to get published in that particular week or 2 or 3 later. Yeah, it would just be really nice, and we all wish that there's a great one-stop shop for newspapers that had everything exactly the publication we needed, that covers the dates needed and represents a complete collection. Unfortunately, this kind of newspaper research utopia just doesn't exist. And if it did, I wouldn't be here talking about this class and talking about the newspapers. But check with local libraries, see what's available. Again, it may be physical collections. Many of the small community newspapers are not online. They're going to be physical collections. Check nearby. Don't stick to your date. And also cite your sources. I'm going to reiterate that over and over and over. Cite your research sources, cite the article sources. You'll thank your past self, or you'll in the future, you'll thank your past self when you have to go back and refine an article in your research. So there are some online resources that are available. Don't mean to be a complete downer on the fact that it's not all online. Well, yes, and so there are some free stuff. The Chronicling America is a great resource. Again, like I said, there's no one-stop shop. Each of these has a different slice and collection of newspapers, depending on where in the country they are, where in the world they're from. And the smaller the community, the less likely it is to be in one of the large paid databases that aggregate newspapers. You're probably really looking to only find larger regional, something that covers large regional or a large community daily paper, Dallas Morning News, which can also be considered regional, but yeah, something like that. Maybe the newspaper for a county seat, if it's a large county, it might get picked up by some of those larger paid places, but there are still some of the free stuff. The Chronicling America, WorldCat, again, your local libraries, some may have gotten grants to actually scan and digitize early publications, and they may have those available. Or they may be like us, it has them on microfilm that hasn't got them digitized and available online publicly. Ancestry Library Edition, which is free with your library card. You can find some newspapers. Also the Fold 3, which is typically used for your military research. When you're looking at your service members that served in your family, that's free with your library card, but they also have newspapers. You can also approach the different genealogical or historical societies that may be in existence in the different counties or different states, may have some specialized collections. In Texas specific, you've got the Portal to Texas History, which has many newspapers in the Portal to Texas History. And those, what's really neat about those are keyword searchable. So you can go in and search just like if you were going to Google something, and it'll go through and search and find. It's a really nice platform. Has a lot of good resources. They're trying to build. They have it's hosted by the University of North Texas, and they're trying to build a really good representation of Texas newspapers through the portal. That's one of their projects. If you happen to be one looking for genealogy research in Oklahoma, and I forgot what the name of it is. Oh no, I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, Oklahoma has a thing that looks very much like the Portal to Texas History, and there's a reason for that. It's also hosted by the University of North Texas, but it's the Oklahoma Historical Association or something, one of their heritage groups that is doing something very much like the Portal to Texas History, but for Oklahoma. And part of their collection is an extensive collection of newspapers from Oklahoma. And those are pretty, from what I can tell, pretty neat and big collection of Oklahoma newspapers. So if you're looking for family information and researching Oklahoma, that might be a good resource for you, and that's also free. USGenweb.org is a um, is a free resource. It's run by volunteers, and you can go through. I lost my. Had something specific to say about that. It's a database that's run by volunteers, and it's a collection of resources that are collected by various societies or individuals that pertain to genealogy resources for whatever state or county that may be. But you might be able to discover, depending on, again, it's volunteer run, so not all sites look the same or contain the same information. You click on the state, you can navigate to the various county sites and see what they list, what the volunteer webmaster for that page has links to. But you might be able to discover the names of other publications that existed at different periods of history for a community, for a county or a parish. I remember there was, I looked in Louisiana for a particular parish, and the site listed a lot of newspapers, many of which I had never heard of before. And it was in the industry for most of my life, most of my early half of my life. And many of the publications, I don't even remember anybody talking about. So that was a wild discovery. So you may discover names of publications that may give you a clue of what to search for or what to maybe find at a state archive or state library or a local library or archive, historical or genealogical society may have in their resources. Also, the Family Search is a nonprofit organization. It's free to create an account. This is a free service provided by the Mormon Church, but they have a ton of information digitized from many states and counties in many countries, and you can search their catalog and their books. So it's pretty amazing. And I think I'm getting ahead of myself on some details. This was mainly just a placeholder for some of this. And I started going in on some of these individual, and I've got slides for those. My apologies. I was just so excited to jump into the content. This is actually more useful for you to see these. I'm going to back up. We're chronicling America. So this is a very long-term effort to provide a searchable database from the Library of Congress. And it's in collaboration with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress. And this provides access to information about historic newspapers. And it does provide a select digitized newspaper pages that are produced by the National Digital Newspaper Program. And it does have a newspaper title directory, so that might be another good spot for you to discover what titles may have existed at different time periods. And the papers that appear in this collection, the Library of Congress considers these to be in the public domain. So, and they, as it says here on the slide, it covers 1789 up to 1963 for historic U.S. Newspapers. And then WorldCat, you can search catalogs. If you find a name of a publication, you can always try to plug that into WorldCat and see who might have that in the collection around Texas, or you can choose worldwide. And this is really useful for finding the newspapers that are in, like I said, public libraries, but especially academic libraries. You might find these listed especially some of the older ones and historical ones, you'll find listed which universities may have them. That gives you an idea of maybe they have them online, or if they don't, you can plan your road trip, or at least find what kind of information you need to provide to gain access for research purposes. And I had already mentioned some of what we carry, our very own genealogy center here at the Plano Public Library. We've got the Plano Star Courier. And as you can see here with this little screenshot, I don't know how well you can see that. At least we go back to 1918. May not be complete sets. I can't remember if those are complete or not, but everything we have in the library's collection is in the library catalog. Just like if you were searching for your next great mystery read, we also have the genealogy resources listed in the catalog as well. We have able to search for the Dallas Metro News collection and the Dallas Morning News, the historical archive. So that'll take you back to 1885. And of course, the McKinney Public Library has links there for, they have newspaper, birth, engagement, and marriage, obituary resources, things of that nature. So a little bit, at least the county seat information. I had mentioned Ancestry Library Edition. The library edition is free with your Plano library card to access. That's one tier. The individual membership, they sell those because this is a for-profit company, Ancestry.com. But you can subscribe on your own if you wish. I don't remember enough about the individual membership to know if newspapers are part of that individual membership or not, but certainly the membership level for the library, the Ancestry Library Edition, does have newspapers, U.S. and international, and it has some international records as well. Oops. Yeah. Fold 3, as I had mentioned earlier, it's also an Ancestry product, but unlike the Ancestry Library Edition, where you have to come to the library and use one of the public computers at any of the Plano Public Library locations, you can access Fold 3 from home with your Plano Library card. And it includes digital collections and include actually historic newspapers from the 1700s through the 1900s, which is incredible. But the digital collection began in 1999 as part of what was called iArchive, and then it was later Footnote.com in 2007, and then they rebranded to Fold 3 in 2011 after it was purchased in 2010 by Ancestry. But that's a good one to go through. The various genealogical and historical societies are also good resources to look through and discover information that you may be looking for about newspapers. Now, the Texas State Genealogical Society, I can't talk. The Texas State Genealogical Society doesn't appear to have a collection of newspaper resources listed on their website. It's just presented here as a illustration of a larger organization in Texas. Other states, genealogical societies or heritage associations or whatever they may call them in other states, on their state agencies may in fact have links for those states for newspapers. So it really depends on state by state. Oh, here's my note. I had mentioned the the Oklahoma group that was hosted by UNT, the Oklahoma Historical Society, that has a newspaper archives for Oklahoma. And if you're going to or familiar with the portal of Texas history, it'll look very similar because it's hosted by UNT, same kind of platform. But there are many organizations on the national, regional, county, and local levels scattered throughout the U.S. that may have resources for that. I already mentioned the portal of Texas history. All of their newspapers that they have on the portal and their mission for their Texas digital newspaper program is to make the Texas newspapers freely accessible online and fully word searchable. So they've got many partners with communities, institutions, and publishers around the state to make this happen. Here's the name of the Oklahoma thing if anybody's interested. It's the Gateway to Oklahoma History. I knew I had it. I just had it noted in an odd spot, and I drew a blank on it. So the Gateway to Oklahoma History, that's the Oklahoma Historical Society's collection. And I had mentioned US Gen Web. It's free access. It's volunteer run. It's a collection of resources. Totally depends on the state, the county, and if there is a volunteer who has, I don't know what you would call them. I call them webmaster. I don't know if they have a term. Whoever is the lead volunteer for a county to curate the collection of resource links. They're all going to vary, but it's still a very good resource. It's a good place to, peek in and see what might be available for your particular state or county that you're looking for. And at the very least, if it's an active one, you can always email the volunteers and maybe they could point you in some good direction of who might have some resources for the newspapers for their particular area, because they would be the most knowledgeable source for that. So you just can't finding online and not sure, just ask them, find them, and hopefully there is the county or the parish that you're looking for has an active person. There are some that I've seen randomly going through helping patrons that someone has either retired or, dare I say, passed away, and there's no longer anybody actively managing a collection set. Oh, yeah, and this was an example where I had mentioned that originally from this area, and there was quite a few newspapers from that list that I had never knew existed and never heard of before, which I thought was brilliant to find a list like this. And then it has comments in the margins there about where you might be able to find copies of those newspapers. Like some newspapers were published from 1890 to 1916, and they're weekly, and you can find them at one of the university libraries. You may be so lucky to find a list like that. Family Search, again, it's a nonprofit. They've got, according to their site, they've got historical record collections from 655 AD until today, and over 4 billion names worldwide, but it's got a lot of resources as well. It may look similar, and you may wonder, hey, they both kind of similar. They're both based in Utah. Completely different. One's ancestry is for profit, Family Search is nonprofit. Their records only overlap 10%, and those are probably federal census records. So fully 90% of each of their collections are totally different and unique from one another. So it's not, I prefer to use this one over the other. It's like if you're doing your full research and really working on your genealogy, you need to use both to really get a full slice of information and make sure you exhaustively search for what you're looking for. The Briscoe Center for American History is at the University of Texas at Austin. And this has a very large newspaper collection, more than 4,500 titles from Texas, the southern U.S., and some non-U.S. newspapers. It has a newspaper clippings morgue. And of course, it has especially collections for Gannett newspaper collections. This is really one of the largest newspaper collections of its kind in Texas. When I mentioned the newspaper clippings morgue, that's the clippings morgue of the New York Herald Tribune, the New York Journal American, New York Times, and Newsweek magazine. Also has specialty collections, also include the Natchez Trace collection of newspapers. Those are not digitized though. And the Gannett newspaper collection, which is also not digitized, but it includes collections of newspapers both from the U.S. and non-U.S. covering significant events. So it's kind of like, and I've seen some of the listings for these. They're kind of like I had mentioned the newspaper exchanges. It's just on a bigger level. Larger newspapers checking out what competition around the country or around the world are publishing about significant world events or historic U.S. events. I will say that this site is not particularly easy to navigate or to search. It's really a more advanced research, and it probably is going to require you to, go actually visit the Briscoe Center to do your research. I couldn't find any really useful link ability to delve into looking at individual newspaper titles and things. They have an extensive holding, but and some finding aids, but I found it difficult, challenging. So for what it's worth, it's still a good, incredible resource, the largest collection probably in the state. But it might require a road trip to Austin to visit and research. Genealogy Bank is a product of Newsbank. It does have a subscription required, and it carries newspapers from 1690 until today. And so we're 13,000 big city and small town newspapers. So there are some small town newspapers aggregated in this collection. And they claim 95% of the newspapers are exclusive to Genealogy Bank. So this is where we can find, because you can find this through PPL. You can access the Dallas Morning News. They do have individual membership subscription. Since that is a paid subscription. They got newspapers from all 50 states. So interesting resource. And I pulled up here some examples. At least you can search by city. It'll provide you a title. And then you can see the years of coverage, the years that they have the newspapers in the archive. So like in the first one, I don't know if you can, how well you can see that online, it's Abilene, it's the Abilene Reporter News. So they've got from September 1st, 1910 through March 31st, 2018. That's the years they've got covered. And I don't know if I had mentioned, I think I forgot to mention, this is a good example here. You see the Abilene Reporter News, the hyphen news. Let's see, was there another one here? Yeah, Alice Echo News Journal, Amarillo Globe News. A lot of times when you see those, a hyphenated name especially, that to me, as being raised in a newspaper family and being in the industry for a good chunk of my life, I recognize that as newspapers that merged. So at some point, that may be a little clue as you're looking up something. At some point, in that first example, Abilene Reporter News, there may have been two newspapers, the Abilene Reporter and the Abilene News, that got bought out or merged at some point, and they became the Abilene Reporter News. And like Alice Echo, there might have been the Alice Echo and then the News Journal at some point in time as separate publications. And then at some point they got one bought the other, or maybe they were both bought out by a larger organization and merged. And a lot of times they hyphenate the names to kind of carry on the tradition, provenance of the name, maybe. Then there's newspapers.com, also an Ancestry product. And also a subscription required for this. They claim to be the largest online newspaper archive. I've got nothing to verify. This is strictly off their site. But they claim to have over 16,700 some odd newspapers from the 1700s to the 2000s, and millions of pages added each month. And they have at least the time that we did this note here, they had a basic level subscription that allowed you to do clipping and sharing, and an advanced subscription to give you access of an additional 415 million plus pages. But they do allow, they do OCR, the optical character recognition page images, which allows you to search for text. So you could do a name search. And you can kind of go down the rabbit hole a lot on these and at least look and search through. A lot of times they'll give you at least access where you can at least search through them. You may not have the ability to look at the page, but at least you'd be able to see, oh, I can see Texas. I'm looking at Shiner, Texas. They have the Shiner Gazette. Here's the years that they have. Does it have a year that I'm looking or interested in of the month? And then they really do break it down. So in this case, in what's this, 1894, May of 1894, they have 3 issues from May of 1894. So they have something covered, but it's just not all issues. Newspaper archive, and we're getting towards the end, trust me. Newspaper archive, again, is another one of those paid subscription services. They claim newspapers from 1607 through today, with over 108 million plus obituaries and almost 16,000 current and historic newspaper titles. And they claim over 9 billion names. So, and it has collections that cover all 50 states and 32 international countries. So all of these are going to give you a slightly different slice of information, different papers, different regions. They present their information collection, what's in their collection a little differently. In this case, looked up the McKinney Courier Gazette. They hold 1910 to 1977. And then they give a little, I guess, a little bar graph there across the top, showing you their concentration of the years that they have the most copies, most issues. So you can see in 1910, they just have a handful. It's probably not a complete year of 1910. It's probably just a few issues, like the previous example we had seen. Whereas they half of 1968, and looks like they cover all of 1969 pretty well, most of 1970, same way with 75. It kind of gives you a visual clue of the concentration of their collection. American Ancestors is a product of the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And this one's fascinating. It is a paid membership, but it's a nonprofit organization, and they have a special collection of 19th century newspaper database, which is kind of interesting. So it has an impressive range of education and services, original research and family histories, but it really is that special collection of including the newspapers and the family histories and photographs. It's really kind of cool. But they also offer a lot of webinars and things. I don't want to get into a unpaid advertisement for them. It is a individual membership. Provides standard access to the some of their resources. So, So you just have to explore some of that. So are there any yearning, burning questions that I just haven't covered yet this evening?
There's been nothing in the chat recently, but if people have questions now, it'd be a perfect opportunity to ask.
Yes, please do. And I will say that if you can't think of anything now, that's fine. You can always reach us, the genealogy team, at genealogy@plano.gov. That email gets to the whole of the genealogy team, and we can try to answer that for us. If you're not quite sure what you're looking for or where to go to resource, we can help with that.
One of the Q&A questions was asking if this Zoom class would be available to watch later, and it will be available
Yes.
on the Plano Public Library YouTube channel.
Yes, it will. Very good question. On the YouTube channel for the Plano Public Library, we have a playlist for Genealogy Center programming. So all of our online programs are there. Actually, many duplicates of them. We've done them over the last 3 years. They're all there. So you might want to explore some others that you might have missed, or one of the face-to-face classes you missed. Go look for it and pick it up and do the online one. Very good question. Yes. All right. Thank y'all for joining us this evening. I appreciate y'all sharing your time with us. I hope you got something out of this. I wish I could say, yes, this is a one-stop shop. This is get you everything, but then we probably wouldn't have a class, would we? It's simple enough, but it is difficult to find those pieces in the newspaper. It just takes some perseverance and some digging, which can be annoying to a lot of people, and it also can be a challenge, a fun challenge. But if you get frustrated, again, please feel free to drop us an email, genealogy@plano.gov, or stop in and see us here at Haggard. We're in the basement of Haggard. We will gladly try to help you, connect you to a resource, or where to find that resource, perhaps. Just have some patience, because newspapers sometimes are not that forthcoming, depending on where they were from and what time period.
All right. Yeah, no other questions have popped up, but people have been saying, thanks for the good information. Thanks for offering this. So,
Yeah.
yep.
Y'all are all welcome. Again, thank you for joining us tonight.